Eruvin, Dafin Lamed Gimel through Lamed Tes, on Dafim Lamed Gimel through Lamed Hey. The Gemara repeatedly invokes the Machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim over whether there were Gozer, Shvus, Yisurim Drabanan, Ben Hashmashas. The context is that an Eruv has to be accessible to the person making the Eruv, an Eruv Tchumen. In order to be a valid Eruv Tchumen, the bread that you put down, the food that you put down, has to be accessible to the Ma'arev Ben Hashmashas, which is when the Eruv takes effect. So if you can't get to the food without violating an Isser Daraisa, that's called the Eruv is inaccessible and it's not valid. If you can get to the Eruv by doing a Isser that's only Asr Midrabanan, a Shvus, so that depends on the Machlokes Rebbe and the Chachamim. Rebbe says that they weren't Gozer Shvusin, they weren't Gozer Yisurim Drabanan Ben Hashmashas. Doesn't mean they weren't Gozer at all. The post can explain it means they weren't Gozer when there's a situation of mitzvah, like an Eruv or Dochek, a situation of need. They weren't Gozer, and therefore the Eruv is considered accessible. And the Chachamim say they were Gozer on a Shvus, even Ben Hashmashos, therefore the Eruv is not accessible, and therefore the Eruv is not valid. We paskin like Rebbe that they were not Gozer, Shvus, Ben Hashmashos. In various cases, though, where Shitas Rebbe arises, Tosfos, the post can point out, the Gemara itself points out in one case, that sometimes, even if the Isser is apparently sometimes, even if the Isser is only a Shvus, even Rebbe agrees that they were Gozer. For example, right at the beginning of Daf Lamed Gimel, the Gemara talks about one of the cases where the Eruv is up in a tree, and the tree bends and zigzags, and the Gemara and the Tosfos is discussing whether it's possible to get the Eruv down from the tree, across the tree. The Gemara says, Yiboy Maisla Derech Alav. So Tosfos is discussing various ways where the Eruv would be able to be. The Gemara explains that you can't get the Eruv without doing Malacha Daraisa. Tosfos comes up with various ways that we could reduce the Malacha Daraisa to a Drabanan. Ze'oker v'zemeniach. One person makes the Akira, one person makes the Hanacha. You don't have Hotzah and Shabbos unless one person does the entire Hotzah. So Tosfos struggles with various versions of this question, that there are ways to do it without a Malacha Daraisa. Tosfos concludes, even according to Rebbe, not every Shvus is Mutter Ben Hashmashos. Certain Shvusin were particularly stringent. Rebbe is Machmer on those Shvusin, even Ben Hashmashos, because they can easily lead to a Malacha Daraisa. The basis for this is the Gemara later. The Gemara brings a Mishnah that talks about if the Eruv is on top of a kana, some kind of reed, some kind of growing thing, that the Gemara brings Machlokes. The Gemara brings one position. The Gemara has one side that's only the Rabbanan, because you can't use this, because since climbing a tree or climbing growing things, manipulating growing things is an Isser Rabbanan, according to Rebbe it would be good, just not according to the Chachamim. But the Gemara quotes one opinion that even Rebbe would say this is not a valid Eruv, even though we're only dealing with apparently a Shvus. So the Gemara says, even Rebbe agrees, Gzeira Shema Yiktam. It's a kana, there's a Gzeira that you'll break off a branch, that's us, or even according to Rebbe. But it's still a Shvus. Gzeira Shema Yiktam. Gzeira means Shvus. So why would Rebbe agree? So Tosfos says, because certain Shvusin, which are so close and so easily lead to Isser Daraisa, even Rebbe agrees that those Shvusin are Asr Ben Hashmashas. And this is how we paskin. This is how the post can paskin. We paskin like Rebbe. The Shulchan Aruch says, Kol Hadvarim, everything that's only a matter of Shvus is Mutter Ben Hashmashos, Lagazer Ben Hashmashos, for mitzvah or for dochek. Mishnah Berurah says, Kol, even though Kol sounds very broad, very inclusive, it's lav dafka. There are various examples of shvusin that are only midrabanan, but there still goes there, even l'tzarach mitzvah, even according to Rebbe. Mishnah Berurah gives various examples. The Gemara's example, the Gzeira Shema Yiktam, when you're dealing with a reed that's very easy to snap pieces off. There's Gzeira Shema Yiktam to carry something less than Daled Amos. Midaraisa, you can carry multiple times, each time carrying 3 Amos, and that's fine. But midrabanan, you can't do that because it can lead to Hotzah. And that shvus of carrying less than 4 Amos, there goes there even Ben Hashmashas. Malacha shein tzricha legufa. Malacha shein tzricha legufa, according to some Tanaim, according to some poskim, is only drabanan, but that's more stringent than other shvusin. So there are various shvusin that even according to Rebbe, even according to the halacha, they were gozer ben hashmashos even for mitzvah. Muktzah is one example of moving stones, and is one example of a shvus that they were not gozer according to Rebbe, because the Gemara, one of the examples the Gemara talks about is if the Eruv is buried under a pile of stones. So the Gemara says, according to Rebbe, the Eruv should be fine, because just moving away the stones is only a shvus, and that's mutter. So the Gemara says, yeah, but in a case that you need mara v'chatzina, in a case that involves actual shovels, actual digging, that's a real malacha, then even Rebbe agrees, but just moving around stones, that's one of the cases Rebbe does maintain that such a shvus, they were they were not gozer ben hashmashas. Some other halachas about this sheet of Rebbe that they weren't gozer shvus ben hashmashas. This is only relevant if you were not Makabel Shabbos yet. It's Ben Hashmashas, but you weren't Makabel Shabbos. You're supposed to be Makabel Shabbos before Ben Hashmashas. If you weren't Makabel Shabbos and it's Ben Hashmashas, you can do a shvus. But a person who was Makabel Shabbos, Mishnah Berurah says, for example, you said Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbos, or you said L'chadodi, that constitutes Kabbalah Shabbos. Then, even if it's during the day, you made early Shabbos. And even if it's just the tzibur that did it, then you cannot do any shvus, even for Dar Mitzvah. You can have a non-Jew do it in certain cases, but then Rebbe's whole din of Shvus Ben Hashmashas does not apply once you are Makabel Shabbos. Mishnah Berurah Biur Halacha also talks about how this applies to Ben Hashmashas and Motzei Shabbos. The Sugya generally discusses Eruv is always relevant to discuss Ben Hashmashas between Friday and Shabbos. That's when the Eruv takes effect. But this general din that according to Rebbe, the Gzeirus of Shvus don't apply Ben Hashmashas, do we have a corresponding leniency Motzei Shabbos? But before Havdalah, Motzei Shabbos, can you do a Shvus if it's Ben Hashmashas? So some poskim say no. They say that Ben Hashmashos, since Shabbos has to leave, there's a kind of presumption of Shabbos, so it's more stringent, and you cannot do a Shvus Ben Hashmashos. The Mishnah Berurah brings different opinions. He says the Beis Meir says the Meikra Din you can be lenient because it's the same question. It's the same Ben Hashmashos, even though it's Ben Hashmashos at the end of Shabbos rather than the beginning. In principle, it's the same thing, and Rebbe would be lenient about Ben Hashmashas. However, he says Yesh L'Maisa as a practical matter, Yesh L'Hachmer, because we don't really know exactly when it's still Vadei Shabbos, when it's only Ben Hashmashas. You think you're doing it Ben Hashmashas, it might still be Vadei Shabbos, and therefore you shouldn't do it. I don't really understand the Beis Meir's perspective. I don't understand why you don't have the same question at the beginning of Shabbos. If we let you do a Shvus Ben Hashmashas, you might wind up doing it at a time that it already is Vadei Shabbos. There are all kinds of opinions. 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, 72 minutes. So I'm not sure why Erev Shabbos this concern doesn't apply, but as a practical matter, the Beis Meir says that Motzei Shabbos you shouldn't rely on the leniency of doing a Shvus Ben Hashmashas because it's hard to be sure that it's really Ben Hashmashas and not Vadei Shabbos. The Biur Halacha brings from the Prima Gadim, we're talking about doing a Shvus Ben Hashmashas. What happened to Tosfos Shabbos? Ben Hashmashas is only a suffix Shabbos, but he's supposed to be Mosif on Shabbos. It's not enough to keep Shabbos. You have to add to Shabbos. Prima Gadim says that maybe the Biur Halacha brings that Ulai Enochinami. At the last moments of Ben Hashmashas, you can't do a Shvus because that's at the very least that's Tosfos Shabbos. It means the earlier moments of Ben Hashmashas you can still fulfill Tosfos Shabbos at the end, and we're talking about the earlier moments of Ben Hashmashas. See, the heter of doing a Shvus Ben Hashmashas is only for Tzarech Mitzvah or Dochik, but the Mishnah Berurah says, the Biur Halacha brings that we use a pretty expansive definition of need. When we say Tzarech Shabbos, we don't mean you don't have food to eat otherwise. We mean there's something that will give you additional Oneg Shabbos, additional pleasure. Even that's considered Tzarech Mitzvah, and even that's considered a valid reason for doing a Shvus Ben Hashmashas. On Daf Lamed Daled and Lamed Hey, we have a further extended discussion about the accessibility of an Eruv. And this time the discussion revolves around physical accessibility. If the Eruv is in a locked chest, a migdal, some kind of locked container, and you don't have the key, the Mishnah brings various opinions about whether that's an Eruv, and the assumption of the Gemara is that it has to be physically accessible. You can smash the chest if you have to, but it has to be possible to get to it by smashing that's only acceptable if that form of smashing and destroying the chest to get to the Eruv is something that would be halachically mutter to do on Shabbos. So it has to be physically accessible, and physically accessible by doing actions that are permitted on Shabbos. So the Gemara says smashing a chest is a problem. You can't do that on Shabbos. So first the Gemara says Migdal Shel Levanim. We're not talking about a solid chest. We're talking about just bricks that are piled up on each other. So taking the bricks apart, the Gemara Gemara brings various opinions as to whether that's Asur on Shabbos or not. But the initial assumption of the Gemara was you have a regular wooden box, a wooden chest that's locked, and you don't have the key. Smashing the chest to get to the Eruv would be a problem. For the Eruv would be considered inaccessible. So later the Gemara seems to contradict this, brings a different opinion. The Gemara says Rabban and Rav Yosef say that a wooden chest, if it's considered a keli, then you're allowed to smash it because ein binyan ustira b'kelim. The laws of binyan and stira here would be smashing the chest, doesn't apply to kelim. And the one who is machmir, they explain the reason to be machmir is because ohelu. If we're talking about if it's an ohel, if it has the status of an ohel, then there would be a malacha because ohel is like a house, and then there would be binyan. But if it's a keli, we say ein binyan b'kelim. And the final step of the Gemara is we're talking about a lock that's tied, and you cut it with a knife. That's apparently also mutter. The only question is whether the knife is muktzah or not. So the initial Gemara assumes that smashing a chest would be a malacha and therefore would make the Eruvin inaccessible. Later the Gemara says ein binyan b'kelim, and Abai and Rav also said that cutting the rope is fine. That's not any malacha as long as the knife is not muktzah. So Tosfos, the Rishonim discuss this. Why did the Gemara originally assume that breaking the chest is a malacha? What happened to ein binyan b'kelim? So Tosfos has two pshatim. First, Tosfos says it's a migdal gadol. If it's a very large chest, ordinary kelim, we say ein binyan b'kelim. If it's a very large chest, that's where there's a machlokas tanaim whether breaking the chest is okay. That's a question of binyan b'kelim. That's a question of stira. But a small chest, we would say ein binyan b'kelim. Tosfos' second approach, however, is just the opposite. That the ikar is that we say yesh binyan b'kelim. If you take an ordinary keli, an ordinary chest, not a large chest, an ordinary chest, and you just smash it, that would be a malacha of soser. We say yesh binyan stira b'kelim. And when the Gemara says ein binyan stira b'kelim elsewhere, that means only particularly flimsy kelim that are certain kelim that are not binyan stira gemura, that you're not doing a real malacha binyan stira, or the Gemara, like the Gemara's example of just cutting a wire, opening up a lock by cutting a rope or a wire, you're not really doing real stira of a keli, or like the Gemara in Beis says, a keli called mustaki, which is just a kind of makeshift, non-durable keli of pieces stuck together with some kind of sticking material. But real kelim, Tosfos says yesh binyan b'kelim. So Tosfos has two pshatim which are very different in their assumption. The first pshat is that be'ikar we say ein binyan b'kelim unless they're exceptionally large. If you the second pshat, be'ikar we say yesh binyan b'kelim unless it's a non-durable keli like a mustaki. The Shulchan Aruch actually is machmir that even though we say ein binyan b'kelim, that's only by a cliche in a gomer like a mustaki, but a real keli we're machmir there's a yesh binyan. The Gon and others follow the lenient, the other Rishonim who are lenient, Rashi, the Yereim, the Vilna Gaon, and other Acharonim follow the lenient view that Mikra Din we say ein binyan b'kelim. This is very relevant to discussions of opening cans and bottles and milk cartons and orange juice cartons and Shabbos. There are a number of possible malachas involved: bona and soser and kareya and machatech and mezak and mana. But regarding the most straightforward, the malacha of soser, if you open a can, are you considered breaking the keli? Is there any issue of binyan or stira in the kelim? So according to one sheet in the Rishonim, we say ein binyan b'kelim, period, unless they're exceptionally large. The problem is the Shulchan Aruch paskins like Tosfos' second shot, that we say yesh binyan b'kelim unless it's a particularly flimsy keli. So here we have the issue when we're dealing with disposable containers, cans and other things. Are these considered ordinary kelim that we're machmer according to the Shulchan Aruch and we say yesh binyan b'kelim, or are these considered, because they're disposable, they're not meant for durable use? They can sit on the store shelf for months or years, but they're not meant to be used as a durable keli at home. So that's why some poskim say that we say ein binyan b'kelim. These are called kli garua. So even according to Tosfos, these are inferior kelim, and therefore these are like mustaki, and therefore it would be mutter. The contemporary poskim bring that Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Elyashiv both held that these types of disposable cans and so on and so forth, these types of kelim are considered like mustaki. So even according to the stringent view in Tosfos, the malacha of stira would not apply. There still are other issues that might apply. If you make a neat hole in the keli, like you open it in a way that creates a spout, that itself might be considered binyan because you're making a pesach noah, or the malacha of kareya. The Aruch HaShabbos explains that the idea that a flimsy keli, we say ein binyan b'kelim, is specific to the malacha of binyan and stira. Other malachas like kareya or machatech, different types of cutting malachas, are not apply even to flimsy kelim. So when you're dealing with cartons, paper-like substances, where the old kind where you pulled it open and you tore it and you like that, so those types of kelim might actually be more of a serious problem, because even though they're less strong and durable than metal, so sosa would be even less of an issue, but kareya might be an issue. But I'll call upon him the idea of binyan stira b'kelim, ein binyan b'kelim. There are numerous contradictions, and we follow the stringent view that ordinary kelim, malachas of binyan stira, do apply, but mustaki, these flimsy and non-durable kelim, they don't apply. And some poskim want to say that our disposable kelim have the status of mustaki. Dafim lamed vavin lamed zayin, the Gemara discusses breira, yesh breira and ein breira in the context of an eruv. The Mishnah talks about a person who makes his eruv conditional. He says, If Gentile enemies are coming from one side, from Mizrach, I want my Eruv to be on the other side so I can evade them. If the Chacham is coming on one side, I want the Eruv to be on that side so I can go toward him. The Gemara brings, sometimes it's the reverse, sometimes you want to avoid the Chacham and you want to approach the Gentile, you have dealings with him. But either way, the Gemara talks about these conditional Eruvin, that you're placing you're placing two Eruvin, and you say if he comes this way, I want the Eruv to be on that side. If he comes this way, I want the Eruv to be on that side. So that works. The Mishnah says that works. That's fine. You can make such conditions and make your Eruv conditional on, you can have dual conditions, this way, that way. If both of them come, I want to have the choice to go either way. If neither of them come, I want there to be no Eruv. I want to just go back to the default of having my city be I want to be like everyone else in the city. The Gemara says it's machlokes, lesel masnisa and midatani ayo. There are opinions that say ein brera b'daraisa, ein adam masnel shnei dvarim kekachet. That once you start making conditions involving multiple outcomes and multiple possibilities, that's an issue of brera. We say ein brera. The Gemara then goes, we have an extensive sugya on brera, long and complex sugya in other places in Shas, one of the difficult sugyas of Shas. The Gemara goes back and forth on whether we say yesh brera or ein brera. At one point, the Gemara proposes a distinction in the sheet of Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara goes through the opinion of numerous Tanaim, which ones hold yesh brera, which ones hold ein brera, numerous prices, contradictions, changing yersos. At one point, we have a steer in Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara proposes maybe we can resolve a certain contradiction in Rabbi Shimon by saying that he does not hold a brera in the context of Dinei Daraisa, but he does hold a brera in the context of Dinei Drabbanan. We're more lenient. The Gemara says Rav Yosef didn't make that distinction. He felt Rabbi Shimon was inconsistent because he held that if you hold a brera, you hold it even for Daraisa. If you don't hold a brera, not even for a Drabbanan. He did not distinguish between Daraisa and Drabbanan in the context of brera. He held either all or none. Halacha l'maisa, the ikar and halacha is we do make that distinction. We paskin that we do not say brera on a Daraisa, but we do say brera on a Drabbanan. And the Mishnah, which is from Eruvin Tchumen, we paskin Eruvin Tchumen is Drabbanan, and therefore we do say brera because b'Drabbanan yesh brera. The Rishonim struggle with the question of what exactly is brera. Shas, other Masechtas are full of conditions. People do actions. You can divorce conditionally. You can make financial transactions conditionally. You make a t'nai all over the place. Why is every t'nai not a question of brera? Every t'nai is a condition. How are those conditions different from the condition here you're making about Eruvin? Several approaches in the Rishonim. The Ran brings the Ramban that says that a simple binary t'nai, I want my Eruv to be good if, and not good if not, Eruv yes or no, that's a typical t'nai, that's fine, that would not be brera. But here, it's not just yes or no, it's not on or off. Here you want the Eruv to be either here or there. So besides off, there are two possible outcomes, east and west. That, since the t'nai involves two different things, like the Lashon of the Gemara, ein adam masnal shnei dvarim ke'achad, when there are two possible outcomes that you're doing, that doesn't work. That's an issue of brera. That depends whether Daraisa and Drabanan, that becomes dependent on the sugya of yesh brera or ein brera. Rikveger doesn't understand this at all. Rikveger says it's true if you had one Eruv and the Eruv was sitting in your home and you could magically say I want it to either be an Eruv that way or that way, fine. Then I would understand the Ramban. You want to give the Eruv dual potential, that you can't do. That becomes a question of brera. However, he says you can't do that. An Eruv is only good wherever it is. If you want the Eruv to be on the east, you have to put the Eruv on the east. If you want the Eruv to be on the west, you have to put the Eruv on the west. The Mishnah is talking about you put two separate Eruvin. You put one Eruv on the east and one on the west. And each one you said, if the Chacham is on the west, I'm activating this Eruv and I'm deactivating this Eruv. If the Chacham is on the east, I'm activating this Eruv and I'm deactivating this Eruv. So each Eruv is a simple binary condition, either on or off. You're just making two of them. So Rikreger says, what shnei dvarim ke'echad? You're making two simple t'naim. Each Eruv is either yes or no. It's not one Eruv that can be chal in different directions. That's a simple t'nai. So he doesn't understand the Ramban. He doesn't understand why this is brera. This type of logic comes up in a couple of interesting contexts of the halacha. There is an opinion that when you give a get to your wife, you should only give one get. Normally you only want to give one get, but there are certain cases where we have a halachic problem, how to spell certain names or other issues, where there's no simple solution, there's no simple way to write one way that's Yotze Kol Hadeus. So what we'd like to do is to write two gittin, to write one way and one the other way, and be Yotze according to all opinions. The Ramah brings a tradition from the early authorities. We very much try to avoid doing that. We only give two gittin if it's absolutely necessary. We have a strong a strong desire not to give 2 gittin. Why not? What's wrong with giving 2 gittin? It's a pain in the neck. It's expensive. I heard in the name of one contemporary posik, we really should give 2 gittin more often. It's a lack of Yiras Shamayim that we don't do it more often. But there is an ancient minhag not to give 2 gittin unless you have to. Some of the Sephardic poskim actually recommended 2 gittin pretty often. I'm not sure if they do it today, but they used to historically often recommend 2 gittin. But for Ashkenazim, the Masorah was that they were very reluctant to recommend 2 gittin unless absolutely necessary. So why not? The Ramah gives several reasons. One of the reasons he gives is because ein breira. If you give 2 gittin, maybe it's this get, maybe it's that get, and it's not clear which one it is. That's ein breira. Get is a question of a daraisa. So we're choshesh for the problem of ein breira, not to give 2 gittin. Just like you don't make 2 Eruvin, you do make 2 Eruvin, because that's drabanan, we say yesh breira. But if it would be daraisa, we would say ein breira. It's just like if it's midaraisa, you can't make 2 Eruvin because that's ein breira. So the Ramah says that you can't give 2 gittin. You shouldn't give 2 gittin because it's a problem of ein breira. The get pashut, Moshe ibn Chaviv, says he doesn't agree with this. He says there's not a problem of giving 2 gittin. He says, let me ask you a question. He says you wear Rashi and Rebbeinu Tam tefillin. Some medaktikim wear 2 pairs of tefillin because there's machlokes about the order of the parshiyas. You wear 2 pairs of tefillin. Is that a problem with ein breira because maybe Rashi's right, maybe Rebbeinu Tam is right? No. You wear each pair of tefillin, and whichever one is valid. That's the one you yotze with. In Yana de Yoma, we blow tashrat and tashat and tarat. We blow shvarim trua, we blow shvarim, we blow trua. Why do we blow 3 different things? The Gemara explains because there are 3 possibilities. The Torah just says trua. There are 3 possibilities what the trua of the Torah is. Some say it's genuach v'yalil, shvarim trua. Some say it's genuach, it's just shvarim. Some say it's just yalala. 3 possibilities, we blow all 3. How can you do that? The Get Pashut says breira. If you don't know which is which, and you want whichever one is valid to be valid, isn't that breira? Shnei dvarim k'echad. Says the Get Pashut, breira is only when there's a right answer and a wrong answer, and we don't know which one, and you don't know which one it is. If the Chacham comes, you want the Eruv to be here or not there. You have a preference. You want this, and you don't want that. And if the Chacham goes that way, you want this one, and you don't want that one. You do care. So even though you're saying that I don't know yet, but I want it to work now based on what I care tomorrow, there is an objective right and wrong, and you only want one of them. That's a problem of breira. When you have 2 gittin, or 2 tefillin, he says, or 2 sets of 2 types of shvarims, you don't care. You don't have any particular thing. As long as you're just doing it to be yotzei all the shitas, you don't care which is which. You want to do everything to be yotzei the mitzvah. That's fine. And the raya is from Tkiyah Shofar and tefillin, so there's no hakpad on 2 gittin. The Ramah's application of breira is not a problem, and therefore he says he doesn't think there's anything wrong with giving 2 gittin. In the Sefer Eish Das and Tkiyah Shofar, he also discusses this question of whether blowing the multiple variants of shvarim, tashrat, tashat, tarat, is a problem of breira, is a problem of ein breira, and he goes back and forth, and he actually comes out lulei d'mistafina. He wants to say a great chumrah, a great chiddush, that mitzvahs tzrichas kavana. According to some poskim, we paskin mitzvahs need kavana, mitzvahs deraisa certainly need kavana. So the poskim say that even if you don't say hineni muchan muzuman, but you say the bracha, and then the bracha is in place of that, or you say hineni muchan at the beginning before you start the mitzvah. But here he says there are 3 types of shvarims, and you want the kavana, the verbalized kavana. You're supposed to have verbal kavana. You want the verbal kavana to go on all 3. So he says that's a problem of breira because you want your hineni muchan mezuman or your bracha to go on tashrat if that's the shvarim, or tashat if that's the shvarim, or tarat if that's the shvarim. So you want one statement, one verbal kavana, one amira of kavana l'shem mitzvah to go on all 3. That he feels is a problem of breira. So lulei d'mistafina, he says he would have recommended that before each type of shvarim, after tashrat, before tashat, you should say again hineni muchan mezuman, and before trua, you should say it again. He admits it's not the custom. He admits it's a chiddush, and he says breira is a very complicated sugya. He's just bringing up a proposal for debate, but this is an application of breira to Tkiyah Shofar. On Daf Lamed Ches, the Gemara discusses making an Eruv, making 2 Eruvs when you have Shabbos following Yontif, 2 days Yontif, and so on. So at one point when you have Shabbos following Yom Tov, the Gemara talks about whether you can make an Eruv on Yom Tov or Shabbos. So the Gemara initially discusses the question of Kedusha Achas or Shtei Kedushas, whether we look at Shabbos and Yom Tov as one big Kedusha, in which case the Eruv at the beginning works for the whole thing, whether it's 2 Kedushas and each day needs its own Eruv. But in the course of that discussion, the Gemara brings in a new issue. Even if you say Shtei Kedushas and each day is separate and each day gets its own Eruv, but Rabbi Eliezer says that it's a problem of Hachana, that you're not allowed to be Mechen from Yom Tov to Shabbos, and therefore putting down an Eruv on Yom Tov for the next day, which is Shabbos, is a problem of hachana. Tosfos notes that the sugya goes on and seems to say later in the sugya, later on Lamed Ches, that hachana is daraisa. The Gemara brings a brisa about Shabbos. It says B'haya b'yom hashishi ve'chinu. That in the context of the man, I think it says that Hashem says on the sixth day they should prepare whatever they need for Shabbos. The Gemara, so the brisa darshins chol mechin l'Shabbos. You can prepare on chol. You should prepare on chol for Shabbos. Chol mechin l'Yom Tov. You can prepare on chol for Yom Tov. But ein Yom Tov mechin l'Shabbos, ein Shabbos mechin l'Yom Tov. You cannot prepare, you cannot do hachana on Shabbos for Yom Tov. You cannot do hachana on Yom Tov for Shabbos. So Tosfos says, the Gemara seems to indicate that hachana is an issur d'oraisa. So Tosfos asks, so how can we have an Eruv Tafshilin? Eruv Tafshilin allows us to cook on Yom Tov for the next day, which is Shabbos. We make an Eruv Tafshilin that allows us to prepare for Shabbos on Yom Tov. That's a din d'rabbanan. Eruv Tafshilin is not a biblical institution. So if midaraisa cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos would be hachana, how does the rabbinic institution of Eruv Tafshilin make that mutter? So Tosfos says the reason is, brings the Gemara in Pesachim, that really the issur d'oraisa, if you cook on Yom Tov morning for the next day of Shabbos, you put up a cholent on Yom Tov morning for Shabbos, really that's not asur mid'oraisa, because even though it's hachana, since you could have some guests who drop in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you'll serve them some cholent, so the cooking might be for Yom Tov, even though your real motive is obviously for Shabbos, since it is usable for Yom Tov itself, that's not hachana, because hol mikli archim, that means it's not considered hachana. Still asur midrabanan. Midrabanan you can't rely on that. Midrabanan they gave you the eitzah of Erev Tafshil. That's how Tosfos learns. Hachana is daraisa according to this opinion in the Gemara, and what makes an Erev Tafshil and mutter, it rests on the idea that it's not really asur midaraisa because guests might come. According to that, it follows if you're doing hachana in such a way that it cannot possibly realistically be of any use on Yom Tov, it's asur. You're putting up the food 10 minutes before the end of Yom Tov, and it's not enough time to cook before Shabbos. On Yom Tov, it won't be ready. You're putting up a raw cholent, a kedera chaisa, raw meat. It won't be ready in the few minutes before Shabbos. No guest can come and have any use of it. It would be asur. So you can't do that. So if you want to rely on Erev Tafshilin, according to this approach, since it's asur mid'oraisa, you have to have hol miklu archim, you have to put up the food early enough that it will be ready during the day at a time when guests still might come. There are other opinions, however, that say achana, that say you don't need to have that achana is not deraisa, and so on. And there are other opinions that allow putting up the food even close to Shabbos. How do we paskin? In Shulchan Aruch we say that the Mishbura brings b'shem the poskim that Erev Tafshilin works even if we say that achana is deraisa, it works because of the svar of hol miklu archim, and therefore you shouldn't do it close to Shabbos. However, the Mishnah Berurah says that b'shas adchak, he says that on Yom Tov Sheni that happens on Erev Shabbos, a 3-day Yom Tov, or the second day of Yom Tov is Erev Shabbos, you can be lenient to be somech on other shitas that allow the Erev Tafshilin even without the possibility of guests. Even the first day of Yom Tov, he says, like even when the first day of Yom Tov falls out on Erev Shabbos, he says efsher, not as sure, but he says efsher. Maybe you can be mekel b'shas chak to be somech on the poskim that Erev Tafshilin works even without the possibility of archim, even without the svar of hol miklu archim. The Shibur says, like certainly a person should be careful, should not do any malachos that have no potential for benefit on Yom Tov itself, but b'shas adchak, there's basis for leniency on the second day of Yom Tov, and maybe even on the first day of Yom Tov. The Gemara goes on. The Gemara talks about hachana again, and the Gemara says that when you make an eruv, the question of whether that's hachana, it hinges on whether you have to verbalize any statement about the eruv. If you can put an eruv up silently, the Gemara says that. Question in Tanam, but the Gemara says if you hold that azal v'shasik, you can make an eruv silently, then that's not hachana. But if you have to verbally say this is an eruv, then it's hachana, and you cannot do that. The Gemara says that the Gemara then goes on. It brings a statement that a person is not allowed on Shabbos to inspect his property to see what it needs. These are different types of also so chefzechad, types of activities that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So the Gemara says you're not allowed to do these things even if you don't verbalize anything. You're not allowed to go and do things on Shabbos that are for malacha purposes, for post-Shabbos purposes. So even without verbalizing anything, there's still a problem. So the Gemara says, no, it's not a kasha, because the reason that's mutter is because it is muchacha milsa. Even if you don't verbalize anything, if it's clear from what you're doing that you're doing something for a non-Shabbos purpose, that's a problem. In the case of the Eruv, though, nothing's clear. a person's walking outside to Ma'ariv Baragla, but a person's walking outside for his Erev. If he's a Talmud Chacham, they'll think he was Shmaitza Mashachte. He was learning. He got distracted and he walked out, or he was looking for a quiet place to learn. If he's not Ma'aretz, he's not learning Torah, they'll think he's looking for his donkey. So it's not Muchach. So basically, according to the Gemara, the rule is Hachana and Mimtzal, these things, if you verbalize that you're doing something for the next day, it's a problem. If you don't verbalize it, then it depends whether it's Muchach or it's not Muchach. If it's not Muchach, then it's for Chol, and you don't verbalize it, then it is Mutter. So this is how we paskin in the context of Erev. You can do an Erev assuming you don't have to say anything, because if you verbalize anything, then it constitutes Hachana. The Pri Megadim says you can't make a bracha on the Erev then, because the bracha itself would be considered verbalizing something that it's Hachana. In general, the Isser of inspecting your Nechasim and Tzal Hefzecha, Shulchan Aruch says, even if you're just inspecting Ma'ayin, that constitutes prohibited activity. Mishnah Berurah says, again, the rule is, the key rule is, it depends whether it is Minkar or Milsa, whether it's Nikar, it's clear that's what you're doing or not. If it's clear, then it's Aser. If it's not Minkar, then it's Hirer Basaka. If it's Mer Hirer, then it is Mutter. Mishnah Berurah repeats this several times, that depends whether it is Nikar or not. Elsewhere, the Mishnah Berurah says, the Shulchan Aruch has a siman on what you do on Shabbos, so it says, the Ramah brings, if a person is accustomed for naps, if it's accustomed to take naps, in Ragel B'Shinas Tzarayim, you should take a nap, because that's part of Oneg Shabbos. So the Mishnah Berurah says, but you should not say, I'm taking a nap in order that I can do my malacha on Motzei Shabbos, because again, the nap itself, even if that's your motive, is for Motzei Shabbos, if it isn't clear, if it isn't evident that's the purpose, is not Hachana. But if you're doing it for Motzei Shabbos and you verbalize that you're doing it for Motzei Shabbos, Shenucha, Lassus, Laktenu, Motzei Shabbos, that's a problem. Poskim say that that's a problem even if the thing you're doing the nap for is not malacha. It's even if it's studying Torah, doing a mitzvah, you're saying Erev Shavuos, you're going to say on Shabbos. If you want to sleep on Shabbos, you can stay up at night and learn Torah on Shavuos night. Then even that you can go to sleep, even if you don't usually sleep on Shabbos and your intention is to stay up late. It's not mucha, because people do take naps on Shabbos. But verbalizing that I'm doing it for Motzei Shabbos, that's a problem, even if your intention is l'shem mitzvah. On Daf Lamed Tes, we continue the sugya of shtei kedushas and one kedusha. We previously discussed whether Yom Tov and Shabbos is considered two kedushas or one kedusha. So the Mishnah on Lamed Tes discusses whether the 2 days Rosh Hashanah are considered together one kedusha or two kedushas. The question, there are several nafkaminas. The question is whether the Eruv, again, the Eruv on the first day, can you have a separate Eruv on the second day? Can you have a different Eruv or a separate Eruv on the second day or not? The same question of the 2 days Rosh Hashanah considered one kedusha or two kedushas, also an egg. If an egg was laid, the egg is another case. The Mishnah talks about if a person takes off Maser, can he say, if the first day is Chol, I'm taking off Maser today, if the first day is Kodesh, I'm taking off Maser tomorrow, and by the second day eat the food, because Manavshach, one day is Chol, and therefore you can take off Maser whichever day was Chol, or we say no, it's all one long Kedusha. Another nafkamina post can talk about is the egg. If an egg was, you can't eat an egg that was laid on the same day it was laid, on Shabbos or Yom Tov. If it was laid on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, can you eat it on the second day of Rosh Hashanah? So again, in these shilos, we say that Tarvayu Chashiva Chada Kedushta. That we paskin that it's one Kedusha, the 2 days Rosh Hashanah are one Kedusha, and therefore these various nafkaminas of Eruv and Maser and eggs, we paskin one Kedusha. So none of these cases are so practical. We typically don't eat eggs that are laid that day, and we don't practice Maser today, and these Eruv cases are not so common. There is one application of this discussion which is extremely practical, and that's actually controversial, and that is the question of making a Shechiyanu the second day of Rosh Hashanah. The post can bring a tshuva of Rashi that is machlokas. His Rabbosai, his teacher, said that we don't make Shechiyanu the second day of Rosh Hashanah because Kedusha Achas ain't. Since we pass in Kedusha Achas, it's one long Kedusha, so you only need one Shechiyanu the first day. Rashi himself disagrees. Rashi himself says you do need Shechiyanu. The minhag everywhere he saw is to have a Shechiyanu. Rosh Hashanah like every other Yantiv, he says, because even at the time of Beis Din, it wasn't always clear whether the first day was the Iker or the second day was the Iker. When you keep 2 days, it was because the first day we didn't know, so we kept the first day Kodesh, but the Iker day was the second day. So Rashi says that you certainly need Shechiyanu on the second day. either it's a suffix, he says, or because the minhag was to do it the way they did it back then. They would have Hayom Kodesh or Lachar Kodesh. Certainly you would have Shechianu. They would count the Yom Tovim. They would count everything. When there were 2 days, that means the second day is the Ikr, and they count the Yom Tovim for the second day. So of course you need Shechianu on the second day. So Rashi says, today the Ikr day is the first day, but Shitas Rashi is that you make Shechianu on the second day. That's the sheet of the Rashbam, the Eater, and that is how we paskin. The Gaonim said that you don't make Shechianu on the second day, not at Kiddush, not at night, and not during Shofar either. So the Gaonim and Rashi's teacher said no Shechianu. We paskin that you do make Shechianu. However, we also paskin the compromise of the Rush. The Torah brings from the Rush. A person should have a new fruit and put the new fruit on the table. So to be Yotzei L'chaladeus, since it's Machlokes, where Rambam Rattenberg was knowing this way, to be Yotzei Chaladeus, we have a Shechianu fruit or a garment or something to enable us to make the Shechianu, and it will go on both. That is the custom that the Shulchan Aruch paskins that you should have a new garment or a new fruit. However, in Ein Matzui, if you don't have one, you make the Shechianu anyway. Because again, the Iker is like Rashi, that even though we paskin in the Sugya Kiddush Achasein, Rashi's arguments are still cogent that you still need a new Shechianu. What about the shofar of the second day? So again, the shofar should really be the same machlokes. The Torah brings that if the first day of Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos like this year, then certainly you make Shechianu with the shofar on the second day, because there was no Tkiyah shofar on the first day. But if there was Tkiyah shofar on the first day, then the implication would be that would be the same machlokes as Rashi and then the other poskim, and then you would it would be a machlokes. Mikra din we paskin like Rashi that you need a new Shechianu, but it would be better to have a new fruit or a new garment. The Ramah brings an opinion that when it comes to shofar, you always need a Shechianu on the second day. You don't even need a new fruit. The Mishnah Berurah explains that since there's a mitzvah, you have to blow shofar that you aren't yotzi with yesterday. There's a chiyuv to have shofar. You do need a new Shechianu. So there is an opinion that even though you should have a new fruit or a new garment for the Shechianu at night for Kiddush, but you don't need a Shechianu for the bracha and shofar the second day. However, the Mishnah Berurah says l'chatchila it's better to have a new garment or a new fruit even during Tkiyah shofar on the second day to avoid any suffix again. And to be choshesh for the shitas of Rabosei of Rashi that you don't need Shechianu the second day, neither at Kiddush nor during the Tkiyah shofar. Mishnah Berurah brings that Beis Yosef says that in his place they did not make Shechianu of the second Shechianu when they blew shofar the second day. Aaron is like the Ramah that we certainly do make Shechianu even in a normal year, even in a year where the first day of Rosh Hashanah was not Shabbos and they did blow shofar on the first day. Aaron is certainly that we do make a Shechianu on the shofar the second day of Rosh Hashanah, although again, Mishnah Berurah recommends l'chatchila the Baal Terkeah have a new fruit or a new garment in order to avoid any question of suffix.